Good evening, everybody. We'll just wait. There's a few more people. If we could use these moments, please, if you could just check. They're fabulous little things, and we wonder how life works without them these days, but they can be very, very annoying too. So the first person whose phone audibly rings will go tut, tut, tut. The second person will hiss and boo, and the third person, I've got a bucket of water here, so please check your phones. My name is John Fain. I am a Vice-Chancellor's Fellow at the University of Melbourne, and when the Vice-Chancellor invited me to take up the position, I asked him, what is a Vice-Chancellor's Fellow? And 18 months in, I'm sort of still wondering, but it's a cross between resident provocateur and court jester, as best as I can work out. But it's an absolute honour and a privilege to have been invited to moderate this session with you and some very brilliant people who are going to speak to us about the future of the brain today. And I'm very much looking forward to learning what I can. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we are on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and any First Nations people who are here today. And on a personal note, I add to that I also express my personal impatience for a treaty or treaties in order to address just some of the mistakes of our colonial past. And in order to get to treaty, we need the voice, so we have people with whom to entreat. There's no prospect of a treaty unless we get first to the voice. There you are, that's intensely political just to start us off. I'm speaking to you slightly concussed. And I mean that seriously. Last night at the Super Vets over 60s hockey competition, in plain language, I got cleaned up. And I was prone on the ground for at least a minute. And then I saw stars, and then I felt like vomiting. And then I slowly regained my feet. And then, like a complete idiot, finished the game. We lost. I'm sure that's the most important piece of information for the evening. The point being, though, that I can go home and put a heat pack on my neck or my knee, but there's no equivalent for my brain. Why not? How far away are we from being able to deal with that passing, slight trauma? So instead, I'm brought to you today by the makers of Nurofen. I don't need to tell you the statistics. You almost all know them. It's a tiny part of our body, but, you know, the most complex of all organisms. It works feverishly. Just to say the words I'm saying to you and to look around the room, there's hundreds of thousands of transactions taking place simultaneously. And so much can go wrong with such a complex machine. Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, epilepsy, depression, sleep deprivation, amnesia or headaches. So imagine if you could have a patch that you could attach to your brain and it would solve any problems that come along. Electrical stimulation or some other form of interruption to what otherwise might be the mistakes being made in that complex piece of jelly. Would you use it? Would I go home and say, oh, I'll put a patch on my knee, I'll put a heat pack on my neck and I'll stick a patch on my head? Who knows? Well, that's why we're here. That's what we're here to talk about. It's the role of a university to be a thought leader. We need to explain ourselves better as an academy, and that's the sort of thing that is taking place right now. The other feature is this is cross-disciplinary. Universities are notorious for working in silos. And here we bring people together from different parts of the learning of a university, which is also vital. And that spirit of collegiality is what will undoubtedly characterise our discussions between now and when we finish, along with, most importantly of all, having fun, because it is fun. It's fun to learn things. So our host is Professor Ed Hovey. He has brought this to creation, and I invite him to address you before we get started. Thanks, Ed.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, John, for such a nice introduction. I won't speak long. I just want to say it's a great pleasure to welcome you all here for this inaugural event. We plan to hold a series of these, The Future of, every few months. This one is on the brain, right? Next one is probably going to be on something like skin, growing skin that you can grow on an airplane, on a building. All this technology is busy happening. And there's just an immense amount of, an immense number of really interesting things that can be done when you put a university, a large university like this in the center, and you bring people across from different parts, and you bring, crucially, also people from commercial and legal and ethical directions, and you put them together and say, what would you invent? How would you make it work? I would love to have John's little patch. When my 9-year-old has a headache, I feel so powerless when I can't help her. I can give her an aspirin, who knows, right? I would love to have a little thing when somebody, one of my family members is depressed, and just put it there and just see them get better. I want that thing. I would like that thing tomorrow. So please, your assembled talent and energy and brain power, things that you've done for all your lives, come and tell us about them. And come and tell us in plain language, simple language, so that we can learn and that we can be inspired to go and do whatever we can to help make this future come about. That's what the series is. So welcome. I hope we're going to have fun. I'd like to introduce now Amanda Anderson from the Florey Institute, who has some lived experience, and she'll tell us about this. Amanda.
So 20 years ago, my journey started with epilepsy. I had lived a very normal life here in Melbourne. I was 23 years old, and I was getting ready to go out with some friends to the Stokehouse, famous Melbourne restaurant. And my friend said, "What did you just do?" I said, "Nothing. What do you mean?" "Oh, it looked like you were daydreaming, but, okay." Off we go to the Stokehouse, and it happened again. And my husband now, my boyfriend at the time, said to me, "I think we should go get that checked out." It just looked like I was daydreaming, so not what you would expect when you think of epilepsy. The GP told me straight away, "Stop driving. There's something wrong." I was quite lucky to get into a neurologist quickly because I went privately, thinking that this would be the best way to go. I had an EEG. It showed I actually had seizures while I was having the EEG, so it showed definitely that's what's happening, diagnosed with epilepsy. Immediately at 23, my whole life changed. Unfortunately, the MRI I had showed I was MRI negative, so nothing wrong with your brain. Don't know what to do, put you on some medication. The seizures kept happening. I had to change work because of where I lived. It was too hard to get to on public transport, so I started working in the city. My work was pretty amazing about that. I'd actually completed an advanced diploma in business accounting, and they said to me, "We want to pay for you to go to university to do your bachelor." They didn't care about my epilepsy, which was pretty cool back then. And I did go to university. I went to Monash, but it became really hard. I was working full time. I was studying at night times, and I was having constant seizures. So I actually ended up giving up the study, which was a little bit, not great. And about 2 years into my journey, I thought, oh, medication's not working. I'm going to try the natural method. And I went and saw a Chinese herbalist who took me off all my medication. He actually showed me a textbook that said, "I can do this. And you need to try cupping and a whole lot of other stuff." I had my first tonic-clonic seizure after that because I went from, full medication to no medication. Unfortunately, I didn't stop there. I thought perhaps I'll try a naturopath this time, and kept having seizures. Not great. So at this time, life had changed a lot. Like I said, I'd given up my study. I was working, but I wasn't achieving a lot because my memory was so bad. I fell pregnant in 2007 with our first child, Lucas, and I ended up, after I gave birth to him, which, again, not great when you've got epilepsy, I had a seizure just after birthing him. I remember being happy that I didn't have a seizure during labour, but I had seizures. And my seizures got worse, so much worse, because I had a new baby and I was up through the night. Sleep deprivation's my biggest trigger. And I went to the Monash, which was my local hospital, and they suggested I was seeing a new neurologist to me, Professor David Rutens, and he said, I think we need to do some more MRI and more advanced imaging. And it showed that I had some scarring on my right temporal lobe. I had hippocampal sclerosis on my right temporal lobe. And he said, I think you should have brain surgery. And I was holding a little baby, and I said, that's not going to happen. But unfortunately, things got worse and worse. So it kind of, there's lots of things that happened in between then. At one stage, I suffered postictal psychosis after having a number of tonic-clonic seizures through the night. When I was going through that, I didn't recognise my own child. I was really, I just couldn't attach to him. There was something going on. Obviously, there was something going on. And these things got me thinking, perhaps I do need to think about this surgery. So I went and saw Professor Sam Berkovic at the Austin, who I was referred to, and I said, I think I'm not too bad. I think my quality of life's okay. I'm not as bad as some people. And he said, no, I disagree. Your quality of life could be a lot better, and it looks like it's textbook surgery. I'm like, it's still brain surgery though. I don't want to do that. Anyway, so I started the workup testing, and it turned out, yes, this is perfect for you. It wasn't going to be a cure. They never described it as a cure. They just said your chances of reduction of seizures are 70 to 80%. That's, it's quite big. When you're having seizures multiple times a day and looking after a child, and the fact that after having Lucas, I actually stopped working as well. I'd lost all my confidence in going back into the corporate workplace. So after the workup testing, and by this we're 8 years out of diagnosis, I had the surgery at the Austin Hospital. And that was in next month, it'll be 13 years, and I've only had 3 seizures since then. All brought on by massive sleep deprivation, like having our second child, Hamish, who we welcomed. So life's changed quite a bit since 2010. I was able to have a second child, I never thought I would have another child. And I changed direction. Instead of going back to accounting study, I decided to study a Bachelor of Psychology, and I completed that in 2018. I was inspired to do that going through my surgery at the Austin. I worked with a neuropsychologist, Marie O'Shea, and I was really drawn to this and helping people. I kept in contact with her, and in 2019 she said, Professor Graham Jackson is bidding for this Australian epilepsy project, and he needs someone with lived experience. I know you finished a psychology degree and you're looking to get into this space. Come for an interview. And I got the job, which I was delighted about. So I've been working for the Australian Epilepsy Project since 2019, and it was the single largest investment in epilepsy in Australia, which was amazing in itself. We were awarded $30 million, and one of the biggest things I love about it is that it's the access. We offer advanced imaging, neuropsychology and genetics testing to anyone that fits the criteria to come into our project. So for me, if I had been offered that back in 2003, I could have saved all these years that I think of them as lost years, because, I stopped studying, I stopped working, I lost all this confidence, and it took me till I was 40 to go back into the workplace. So yeah, and since working as lived experience, I've also been able to bring in some of my old skills of finance, and I'm working as a participant lead now as well. So I report on metrics of our project. I follow our participants, making sure that they're going through the project smoothly. Yeah, just a really good experience.
So talk us through. You call those your lost years, but there's plenty of people for who those years are still lost. How do you redesign the system?
That, for me at least, that advanced imaging, the advanced MRI, I wish that had happened straight away, because I had MRIs and they came back negative. They came back with, your brain is fine, perfect. And it certainly wasn't perfect. Part of the story, which I've forgotten as I've been telling it, was I actually had encephalitis as a baby. That was not actually, even though people knew about it, I was seeing clinicians, they knew I had encephalitis. A few people said, no, that won't be it. But Professor Berkovic hopped on the phone when I told him about this and spoke to my parents. He said, tell me exactly what happened. This is what's happened, It's your encephalitis that's caused the scarring on the right temporal lobe. So for me, it's all about the MRI. The advanced imaging needs to be standard.
It's about expertise then too.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's about getting the right person who has the right knowledge, which is deeply specialised. And that's part of what your project now is about. It's about
Yes.
spreading that. Yep.
Yeah, not for like, I feel like it was luck that I was at the Monash and I happened to be under David Ruten's, who studies his PhD under Sam Berkovic, who I ended up seeing. It shouldn't be luck. I feel that everyone should have access to that.
Which is partly why we're here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Amanda. Now, if Chris, Lee and David could come up and we'll get started on panel 1. There are 3 panels that we're going to hear from in turn. There's 2 and then you get a cup of tea and a scone or something, I think. Is that right? A Lamington, whatever. So we have 2 panels of 3 and then there's a 3rd panel after that. Our first panel, now, in order to avoid having to read out lengthy bios, we're putting it up on the overhead, so if you forgive me for not reading out everybody's credentials, take it from me, these people, everyone who is going to speak to you, all the 9 people are experts in their field, highly credentialed, and the bare details are there, and if you want to know more, you can find out more about them later on. So I'm going to ask each of Chris, Lee and David to speak for 5 minutes or so, and I'll ask them a few follow-up questions and then we'll throw it open to you. We will try and keep to time though. So Chris, if you want to go first, and do you want to come up to the lectern or do it from the floor? Where you are, stay there. Yep. That's great.
All right. So, my name is Chris. I'm a clinical neuropsychologist and I work at Austin Health in the epilepsy program, and then I work at the Florey, and I'm actually a colleague of Amanda's. So I'm the cognitive lead on the Australian Epilepsy Project. And so I promise I didn't plan this, but Amanda's given me a beautiful segue. So I'll talk about most of the work I do is around, so neuropsychology is the study of brain-behaviour relationships, and in particular cognition. And in the project, I'll talk about some of the imaging applications that we have that are really geared to trying to further the way we can manage and treat epilepsy. So Amanda mentioned that when she first went and got her scan done, and she was told it's lesion negative. And so that just means on the MRI, there was nothing that indicates a lesion that would be epileptogenic in nature. And so there's a certain proportion of patients with so-called focal epilepsy where you cannot find where the lesion's coming from. And so that leaves you with a real quandary, because without a target, if medication isn't working, there's no identifiable surgical target, how can you go in and intervene? And so one of the techniques that we're working on at the moment, we're running a trial of, is called EEG fMRI. And so in EEG fMRI, you combine 2 modalities. You combine the EEG. So the EEG, you electrodes on the head, and you're trying to record where there's abnormal patterns of activity in the brain that are suggestive of epilepsy. But that information of itself is not often enough to go in and find your surgical target. And so what you can do is, if you get someone with some fancy tricks, you get an EEG cap on their head and then you slide them into the scanner and do an fMRI, then you can use the EEG to define timestamps where that are markers of when epileptic activity is occurring in the brain, and then you can use those timestamps to search within your functional MRI data, which is a measure of neural activity in the brain over time. And then what you're looking for there is, are there certain regions in the brain that are suddenly surging with increases in activity around the time of the seizure? And then if that works, you've got a target. And then that opens the door to surgery being an option. And so this is a potential, this is a potential game changer for people who've been struggling with drug-resistant epilepsy for years. There's no marker on their MRI about what you could actually go and do about this. So we're running a trial at the moment that's seeking to provide an evidence base that this is actually an effective modality for leading to better outcomes in patients. So another technique that we use in imaging is, so just say you have identified a surgical target. The next question is it safe? So can we actually go in there and do surgery? And so in one of my roles in the program is we do cognitive assessments while people are in the scanner. And so we'll do language fMRI as an example. So, a big question in surgery is, if I were to remove this part of the brain, what's the potential cognitive consequence of this? Is someone going to be rendered aphasic? Are they going to be rendered to have a debilitating memory problem? And if we want to generate predictions about the safety of surgery, it helps to be able to go in and localize certain functions in the brain, such as language. So we'll use language fMRI routinely in our people that come through the Australian Epilepsy Project, and that can help with identifying what regions of the brain are likely crucial for language and are therefore no-go zones. It can also help with prognostic information about what's the risks to things like verbal memory. Like most people use verbal memory every day in their jobs, in their occupations. If you were to suddenly lose a significant amount of verbal memory capacity, that could have a radical change to the lifestyle you lead, the occupations that you can pursue. So there's some examples of how we're using task fMRI or cognitive fMRI to inform practices. And do I have any more time? One? Okay, a quick one. I'll just end with a new technique that we've just got the equipment for and we're about to embark on studies with is called high-intensity focused ultrasound. So most people, if you think about, when you're thinking about surgery, brain surgery, you're probably imagining incisions in the scalp, pieces of skull being removed, a terrifying experience. But with high-intensity focused ultrasound, what you can do is you can you can use ultrasound beams and get them to a focal point somewhere deep in the brain. And when those ultrasound beams combine, you get release of energy. And that release of energy, you can use it to actually ablate tissue in the brain. So you can do, effectively, you're doing surgeries without breaching the skull. There's no blood, targeted focal resection in the brain.
So it's almost science fiction because so little changed in the practice of this type of medicine over so long, and then suddenly there's been this explosion. How far along do you think we are? Do you think this is sort of as good as it gets, or is there other stuff on the horizon that's going to just transform it again?
Technology is always the limit, and as more and more technological innovation occurs, which is never going to stop, the sky's the limit.
So we've opened up extraordinary potential.
Yeah,
and this is just the beginning.
Yes, definitely.
Okay, take me 20 years away. What do you think? Take a guess.
That's
and I've chosen
question.
20 because 5 people, you're going to conferences and you're hearing about what's coming in 5, and let's just leapfrog the next couple of generations. And 20 years is, well, I think most of us in this room will still be here.
Mm. Well, maybe I won't go as far as 20 years, but another application of the focused ultrasound that I'm talking about is rather than doing lesions, you can change the intensity of the stimulation that's provided, and you can make the blood-brain barrier permeable. And what that means is normally you can't have things like agents crossing the blood-brain barrier and getting into neural tissue. But if you can open that up, then you can get targeted delivery of things like drugs. So if you want to have a highly specific effect of a drug and you want to minimize the likelihood of side effects of that kind of a drug.
So we can get rid of side effects in lots of things, for instance.
Well, hopefully.
Possibly.
Yes. Don't want to promise the world here.
Okay. Now, we will be taking questions. So when we get to questions, and thank you, Chris, and we'll come to Lee in a second, just to let you know, as you prepare questions, I will invite you to ask a question of a specific member of the panel, not the whole panel. Okay, because that's like asking 3 questions. So then fewer people get to ask them. So think about it as you hear from each of our panellists. If you want to ask a question, it's a question. It's not a chance for you to do a 5-minute performance or sing a song or recite a poem. It's a question and it's to a specific person. Lee, let's go.
Okay, looks like this is on. Is this now on?
Yep.
Okay, excellent.
Trust it.
I am far too old to be sitting here with the phone in my hand as though I'm surgically attached, but my brain isn't working quite like it used to, one might say. So if I forget what I wanted to say, I have notes on here. So I'm in biomedical engineering and have a background very similar to David in that we both came from electrical engineering and computer science backgrounds. And about 20 years ago, I, after being quite bored in what I was doing in electrical engineering, discovered brain imaging and am a complete evangelist for MRI in particular. Knowing that Chris was talking ahead of me, I was a little bit disappointed, I must admit, because I can wax lyrical about where else does quantum mechanics meet physiology, right? Apart from MRI. And 20 years later, can still learn things that I do not know about an MRI system and what applications on the physics side, on the analysis side, certainly on the clinical side. All right, so just to give you a couple of examples of where functional MRI in particular, like some point down the future, and this isn't so much health, but are we getting into mind reading from functional MRI machines? We'll be able to put somebody in a scanner and just read this very low level oxygenation signal in the brain and be able to decode what they're thinking. And perhaps 20 years down the track, that might be where we're at. But there was a Nature paper recently that had people listen to hours and hours of podcasts while in a scanner, and then were able to reconstruct, we're talking AI here, reconstruct actually sentences that they were listening to just from this very low level noisy signal. Right? So it's remarkable. To give you another example more related to health, and this is David, I'm making reference to you a second time. So this is a project that David and I were involved in with Mark Cook at St Vincent's over 10 years ago now, but using functional MRI to see if we could communicate with people in vegetative state. Okay, which certainly not the only people that have tried to do this, but having people in a scanner, having a set of controls who are mental imagery tasks, imagining that they're walking around their house, imagining that they're playing tennis. Okay, and then you do the same thing, give the same tasks to people in vegetative state and see if their fMRI activation maps line up with the controls, all right, to try and give some kind of an idea of whether this person is actually alive, conscious, shall we say. I use engineer speak, not clinician speak, so forgive me. But at this point, I must admit that despite the fact that MRI is my absolute passion, there is another medical imaging modality that really needs to be talked about, which is the areas of molecular imaging. So, in particular, positron emission tomography and PET imaging. So this is where you inject a radio tracer. The radio tracer and I'm just going to call it black magic. If anyone that hasn't done chemistry since year 12, it's black magic. Okay, so the radio tracer tags the protein or the molecule or the organ of interest, and you image it. The radio tracer emits a positron. It annihilates very quickly with an electron, which releases 2 gamma rays that fly off at 180 degrees to each other, picked up by a circular set of detectors. And you can therefore work out, there was some radioactivity in that part of the brain. So we're talking just brain here. So, that to me is the future of brain health as well, because epilepsy, you can do wonderful epilepsy imaging using PET, and what we use it most for in the Melbourne Brain Centre Imaging Unit is for dementia imaging. So again, I'm saying my brain's not quite what it used to be. I'm sure that everybody sitting in this audience would actually really like to know what their future is in terms of Alzheimer's and all the various different types of dementia. And PET imaging is where it's at, and there are more and more tracers that are being developed that can identify inflammatory markers. So we're not just talking about dementia, but for Parkinson's and for MS and etc. Okay, so that's a very, very exciting area that must be mentioned, right? And then you come down to, I suspect I'm nearly out of time, but let's go to the realm of the portable. So what I've been talking about, MRI. Our MRI machine costs nearly $15 million. It's not something that you replace every day. The PET scanners cost $4 million. So what is there in the more portable modalities? So there's something called functional near-infrared spectroscopy, or FNIRS, which is looking at blood oxygenation, much like a pulse oximeter does in your hand, by shining different wavelengths through your finger to work out how much oxygenation, blood versus deoxyhemoglobin there is. Let's do that on the brain. Put some light in, have it refract, bend around and come out somewhere else, and it tells you about the oxygen levels in your brain, which is like a portable fMRI. They just put one of these systems up in space for people to wear up on the International Space Station to look at their oxygenation levels as they're in space. It's amazing, right? So there's lots of future in that kind of portable technology. The other one I wanted to mention was MEG, M-E-G. You've heard of EEG, so electroencephalography. There's also magnetoencephalography. And that, typically you have to sit under this massive hairdryer with these very, very sensitive squid detectors, which again cost a lot of money. University of Melbourne getting the first in Australia portable system to be able to do this while moving. Why is it important to move? So we can do paediatric brain imaging, if you like. So very exciting. The future is amazing. Yes.
Wow. Okay, so it's both exciting and terrifying at the same time. So detecting things like early onset dementia and so on is one thing, but is this also then a pathway to treatment or prevention?
Absolutely. So there are more and more drug trials being done. You might have heard of aducanumab, lecanemab, donanemab. Big Pharma has big stakes here. And yes, we might be able to remove some of the proteins. What is that actually doing side effect wise? It's early days. That's where we're going to be in the future as well. Do a blood test, go and get a PET scan, get treatment 30 years before the signs are there, to hopefully not end up with dementia. That's positively frightening to me, to subject yourself to a treatment years and years before you don't even know whether you're going to get it. But I think that's where we're heading.
Well, there's that whole ethical conundrum, isn't there? You know, do you want to tell people what's going to happen or don't you? And then we get into Shakespearean discussions of destiny, which is another cross-disciplinary discussion to have across the university, but let's skip that one. There's a question, obviously, and we're going to get to this in the third session when we look at ethics, but just from the point of view of someone grappling with the technical side of it, do you think occasionally about the equity, given that we're talking here, you've just told us about, you know, $15 million machines?
Yeah, absolutely.
And, you know, we don't have to go far from here for people to be sleeping homeless and rough, and we can go not far from Melbourne and there are communities that struggle to get fresh water.
Yep. So I can't talk much about the social injustices there, but in terms of access in regional centres, so we're part of the National Imaging Facility, which is an amazing federal government, state government funded, well, that's mainly federal government funded, but anyway, program. There's 14 nodes around Australia, and there is an amazing project that might speak to this a little bit. What if we had low field, ultra cheap MRI scanners that could be in each intensive care where you don't need a really experienced radiologist to operate it? Put your head in it. You don't have to, you know, make sure that you don't have various metal bits in your body. That's a project that's currently underway. There's a company in Boston, a startup, that makes these wonderful little scanners. Now, of course, they give terrible images, right? My ultra high field scanner is so much more beautiful, but yeah, there's only two of them in Australia. Perfect use for machine learning, right? Because you get these terrible images, you get the same people, a whole big control set of people who've been scanned using the hyperfine, the low field scanners, and scan them using a standard 3T clinical scanner, map them between it, and then, hey, presto, you should be able to come out with some beautiful brain images for each ICU. Yeah.
So in the same way as diabetes now, you can have a wearable. We're going to go that way with the brain?
Look, the jury's still out. It is early days, absolutely, because low field MRI in combination with machine learning offers a lot.
Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you, Lee. We'll get to questions shortly after we hear from David.
Thanks, John. Well, Lee already introduced me, saying that I came out of electrical engineering. I was nearly fresh out of doing a PhD looking at automatic speech recognition back in the 1990s when I received a phone call from Professor Graham Clark, who is credited as leading the University of Melbourne's development of the bionic ear. And he said he's looking for somebody who has a speech processing background to come and work on the cochlear implant. And I said, yes, I'll do it. And that changed my whole career. I was looking at going down telecommunications, and I switched across to medical bionics. And that was exciting. So how to stimulate the auditory nerve to help people who have lost their hearing to be able to have a sensation of hearing. And that's now helped hundreds of thousands of people around the world. But I think one of the crucial things that happened was that, along with some colleagues who are here as well this evening, Graham introduced us to, again, Professor Mark Cook at St Vincent's Hospital, and said, well, why can't we take this technology for bionic ear and use it to stimulate the brain to stop epileptic seizures? Great idea. Applied for a grant, and unbelievably, we got it, to look initially at the imaging side of it. So can we use an EEG signal to predict when somebody is going to have a seizure? It's one of the most debilitating things, I understand. The US Epilepsy Foundation did a survey, and they found that it is the uncertainty of knowing when you're going to have a seizure that's one of the most debilitating things about epilepsy. Because you may only have 1 or 2 seizures a year, but you have to assume it could happen at any time. So if we can predict seizures, that would help. So that was 25 years ago. We've now got to the point through, Damien will speak later, but through SEER Medical, there is now an app that is available that will help forecast seizures for people. So that's really amazing to have got to that point. But along the way, we've discovered many other things. Worked in a bionic eye project, brain-computer interfaces, ways of recording from the brain, and learned a lot more about how we can sort of translate technologies that will give a clinical benefit, but where one technology will benefit another. And so what I thought I would do is introduce, so the EEG fMRI is, I know, a very challenging problem because the MRI machine introduces an enormous amount of noise to the EEG. But that shows us where things are happening in the brain, but we want to know why they're happening in the brain in those places. And so that's where the engineering and mathematical modeling is coming into play, where we're looking to see, can we create mathematical models of the circuitry of the brain that will show us that if the brain starts behaving in this way, as you would see from EEG or fMRI or both, why is that? What ion channels are misbehaving? What connectivity strengths have changed? And I think this will lead to a paradigm shift in how how drugs are given. Because if we know what the mechanism is that's gone wrong, we better know how to prescribe drugs for it. We can put devices into the brain, knowing just the right region where we could stimulate the brain and stop the seizures from happening, or stimulate the brain to bring somebody out of depression. Stimulate the brain, well, this already happens now, stimulating the brain to stop Parkinson's tremor. But can we do that better? The other thing is, though, that we're finding that it's not just electrical stimulation, electrical recording that we can do. We can record and stimulate using light. We can make neurons sensitive to light and react. So if we can shine a light on a neuron, we can make it activate. And that's going to be so much more precise than stimulating electrically, because electric charge spreads. A light, you can laser it, right? You can get it exactly where you want it to go. And then the next approach is focused ultrasound. If we dial down that ultrasound even lower, neurons in the brain respond to that. And so we can adjust how the brain is behaving by focusing an ultrasound beam down into a particular region. And you can even use the ultrasound to image where you're steering it, because ultrasound does that. It can image as well as affect the systems. So still early days for some of these things, but I reckon, to address the question you asked before, in 20 years, we will have these technologies that can sense when it is that the brain needs some help and then be able to deliver a stimulation to provide that help.
It's a bit overwhelming. I'll come to questions and I'll just look for hands going up. Have we got a roving mic? We do? Yes, we do have roving mics. So we'll try and get the mic to you so everyone can hear. So there's two of them, and if you give me a wave, we'll direct traffic that way. So, David, one of the key things that you've explained to us on top of what we've already learned is that Chris and Lee are doing all this work, but you're integrating it with a lot of other organisations without whom none of you can do it on your own. So Melbourne's got this quite unique cluster. And when I say unique, not just in Australia and not just in the Southern Hemisphere or the Pacific, but in the world. I mean, if you add up all the different medical institutes that are within, a good drop punt of where we are right now, it's absolutely staggering. Is that one of the reasons why some of this stuff is happening here specifically?
Absolutely. I think that the something that we do really well, and we have the right ecosystem to do it, is to bring together in these projects the engineers, the scientists, the clinicians, the physicians, the
CSLs, the Murdochs, the Weehis, the Dohertys, the comprehensive.
Exactly. I mean, one case in point is that there's many places around the world that have developed one of these sort of brain interface devices. And maybe I should stress, have developed one of these brain interface devices around many different places. Melbourne, University of Melbourne, Monash University, Bionics Institute, and other partners have developed 4, maybe 5, just in the one place. And I think that the reason for this is because of this this willingness to work across disciplines that we have here.
There's also something very innovative about Australians, isn't there? I mean, we see the same in the film industry. We see the same in creative arts. We see it in a whole lot of different areas. Because of isolation, we're more self-reliant or resilient. Is there something there, or is it just mythology?
Oh, I think you're right. I think that we're extremely innovative.
Yeah.
We're always trying to come up with ways to solve problems.
We're also really good at pinching people from all over the world who want to come and work here too. Your questions, looking for like Saturday afternoon out in the auction, what am I bid? Anybody want to ask questions? I've got hundreds. If you haven't, I'll be astonished, because this is truly mind-boggling stuff. People are all shy and retiring. So let me get you talking to each other as well. Where do you expect the next breakthrough to come from? Where do you think, is it going to be technological? Is it going to be a light bulb moment for an individual brilliant scientist like a Graham Clark was, or like a Peter Doherty, our Nobel Prize winner around the corner? What's it going to be that you think is going to make the difference? And let's start again with you, Chris.
Well, I think David already kind of alluded to it with the nature of research now is inherently multidisciplinary teams, and you have to have large groups of experts in their individual disciplines that can actually communicate with one another to solve a specific problem. That's where it's going to come from.
Is it going to come in a laboratory, or is it going to come at a conference? Does it come from sitting over dinner and having too many glasses of Pinot and going, never thought of that before?
Oh, I think the genesis of the idea is probably going to come over a glass of Pinot,
Yeah.
but then it's going to require, I'm kind of repeating myself, but it's going to require teams of people with different specializations finding ways to work together to address that light bulb.
Yeah, I'm going to give a specific example of where I think some big innovation is going to come is with PET scanners that have exquisite sensitivity. And again, sorry, I'm talking about a lot of money here. But if you have what we call large field of view PET scanners, it means that you can reduce the amount of radioactivity that you give somebody. If you can reduce the amount of radioactivity, what's the advantage? You can have them back more than once. Okay, so you can track people's disease progress, or you can give them multiple traces, right? So different traces targeting different metabolic happenings in the brain, and therefore we can be much more precise about somebody's trajectory through illness or towards illness or treatment. So that, for me, is a big breakthrough that's coming. It's on our doorstep.
David, briefly, got some questions?
Yeah. So I already talked about the technology, but I think the real breakthroughs are going to come with the advances in machine learning and artificial intelligence and the ability to interface with these devices. So currently, we can, you can poke electrodes into the brain and record from maybe 100 different or 1,000 different neurons at the same time, and but then how on earth do you make sense of it? And so I think that the machine learning and the ability for machines to automatically work out how to make sense of that and be able to make it useful is going to be the breakthrough.
And not just 1,000, but 10,000, 100,000.
Maybe. I mean, there's certainly people like Elon Musk who have that dream.
I've heard of him, but I'm not quite sure. I trust
not
everything he says. Yeah.
But not just Elon. Here at the University of Melbourne, and in Melbourne, there's the Stentrode device that's been developed, but it will probably not get to that thousands. But then also mainly between physics and RMIT, these sort of carbon fiber electrodes that may allow those thousands to tens of thousands.
All right. I've got some questions. I'll come back to you, Chris. Yep, Ed.
So I have a question actually for everybody, but I think to David perhaps mostly. We heard a lot about the different electrical signals, but the other big subsystem of the brain is chemical, right? The whole psychopharmacology and things. So short of injecting, you can sense well where something is happening, it sounds like. But what you do on the other side and how you sense where the chemical imbalances are and how you targetedly respond to that. Could you say a little more about that side? Because that we didn't hear much about.
Well, I'd rather not, because I haven't done anything since high school chemistry. But no, there is this.
You're not Robinson Crusoe there.
Yeah, chemical messaging is one of the really new hot topics and growing into how can you use the the body's own inherent chemical messaging system to both read what's happening in the body, but also to inject a signal in. And so the treatments for say for epilepsy are not necessarily to stimulate the brain electrically or with light or something, but maybe to inject neurotransmitter into a certain region of the brain. Definitely an area of the future.
Okay, we've got two more questions. I've 1, 2, 3. They're popping up all over the place now. Just we can get the microphone to the gentleman back there I saw first, and then after that, lady on the aisle, and then over here. Thank you.
Thanks. My question's for...
If you want to say who you are, that's fine too. You don't have to.
Not really.
We know who he
Meryl
is.
Harvey. I'm from ACMD, Aikenhead Centre for Medical Discovery. My question's to Chris. I'm a super fan on the Epilepsy Project. I think it's a really important program for democratising the experience that those clinicians have and making it more broadly available. My question to you is, what would make it go faster? And please don't say more money. Money enables things, but if you had more money, how could we make that whole process work faster?
I mean, the one rate limiting step is getting people into the project, building up big data sets that you know. So David was talking about machine learning, and so really we're talking about machine learning applied not just to one modality but across modalities. So cognitive data, imaging data, genetics data. How do we extract features from those individual data modalities and then run analyses across the top of them that find synergistic patterns in there? But you need big cohorts to actually to address that problem.
Okay. Yes.
Thank you very much, everyone. My name's Caitlin Geller and I'm a staff member here at Melbourne Uni. I promise it's not a generic full panel question, but perhaps one more for Lee and Chris, but by all means, David, jump in as well.
But it's not a question to the whole panel, no.
Breaking the rules. We've talked a lot about in this panel, and this has been incredibly interesting, around, you know, Alzheimer's, but also what we're looking at in epilepsy. I have a question around strokes and whether this technology is transferable over to areas around stroke treatment and assessment. And the reason I ask is I had a friend who had a stroke about a month ago at the age of 43, so quite young, and she's quite interested in what is happening in terms of changes. So just wanted to know how translatable this research is.
Okay, Lee.
Certainly MRI is your modality of choice, and there are some exquisite imaging, like submodalities of MRI, like angiography, to be able to see where exactly the brain is affected. But it's okay, I know that there's post-stroke treatment, and so diffusion-weighted MRI gives you some extra information than just your standard anatomical imaging. But it's kind of too late once you've had the stroke, in a sense, and predicting that, I'm not sure. I don't think I'm the right person to answer that, sorry.
But the great advances are in neuroplasticity in stroke recovery, are they not? From an outsider's very scant understanding of it.
Let's go with yes, sure, that sounds absolutely.
But, you know, I think, speaking to your example, you know, post-stroke depression is a big problem. And if we can identify through whatever modalities that there's key networks involved in depression in the brain, then you can go in and you can neuromodulate there, and you can try and alleviate the effects of the depression there. So, you know, we're talking a lot about specific conditions up here, but hopefully we're discovering principles that are general principles that apply irrespective of a disorder.
Okay, amazing. I've got two more questions. Will probably get us to the next panel. Go ahead. With your microphone, please.
I congratulate
With the
you
microphone.
on the things you've been discussing. I find them absolutely fascinating. I've been interested in the brain for many, many years, starting off through psychology, where I read of Pavlov's work, and really that got me into it, and started to find out, try and learn what consciousness was, which seems terribly remote from what you've been doing. But then in general practice, I decided to apply Pavlov's principles of mutual induction to labour, and to try and get psychoprophylaxis working, what is called painless labour.
Could I get you to keep the microphone
Oh,
near your
I'm
mouth so
sorry.
everyone can hear, please?
Oh, okay. The principles of mutual induction, which states that if an area of the cerebral cortex is excited, subsequent areas around the excited area are in a state of inhibition, so that impulses acting on them are not registered by the brain. And I used that in labour and tried to achieve what the Russians have called painless childbirth.
And
In
do you
other
have a
words,
question for anyone on the panel as well?
Yes, I want to. This is quite unrelated to the question, but never mind. Then I came to the effect of drugs on the brain, and in particular statins. And statins worry me. I understand they pass the blood-brain barrier, but cholesterol does not. So they destroy the cholesterol in the brain, and that's one of the preconditions for the tangles and depositions of protein which occur in dementia and Alzheimer's.
And is there a question, please? I have to bring you to a question.
Could I ask for their opinion on the role of statins and the
Okay.
effect of statins on the brain?
Who wants to grapple with that one? Lee.
We might pass that to the next panel. Sorry, I'm not qualified. I don't have an answer.
Yeah, that also is outside my area.
Chris?
If I can't answer the question directly, but I can segue it to a more general question about medication effects on the brain. And I think, this is one area where there's a potential for huge advances where, if I talk about epilepsy, the question is often, well, what's the first line medication? What should I go to? Is this person going to have adverse reactions to this medication, or is this one actually going to solve their seizures? And hopefully by looking at advanced imaging techniques like resting state connectivity, looking at how different regions of the brain are talking to one another, how does that differ from a normal pattern? You might be able to map that to particular medication pathways, or you might be able to introduce a medication and then shortly after measure brain state and be able to tell very quickly actually that medication is going to work, or no, that medication is never going to work. It's rather than waste time, let's trial moving on to a new medication now and just nip it in the bud.
Wow. Okay, we've got one last question I think we've got time for. That'll probably get us to the next panel.
Thank you. My name's Oscar. I'm a researcher from the Bionics Institute. Again, it's kind of relevant to everyone, but I might go Lee for this one. But you spoke about some of the really fascinating developments in individual imaging modalities and how they're getting much more high resolution or portable. I just wanted to get your thoughts on the potential for things like machine learning and AI to actually not just improve the quality of the data, but to integrate data from different modalities. So actually combining, lots of different scans together to see if we can find something new.
Oh, look, that's certainly the holy grail, I think. There's so many ethical considerations there, but there's so many technical considerations as well, that every scanner works a little bit differently, and even when you've got a supposedly harmonised set of data, you have one small parameter different, you're going to end up with slightly different contrasts. And the fact that, if we're talking about MRI, it's not really quantitative, it's relatively quantitative. Certainly then you think about, and this is what we're facing, is working with the vendors of the machines who are very interested in machine learning but need access to all of the data. And then the machines are owned by, not owned, they were made by different vendors who have you under a master research agreement, which means that you can only do certain things. There is all sorts of headaches along the path to that holy grail, but certainly that's where we're going. It's just very uncertain as the path to get there.
Raises questions of privacy, raises questions of patient confidentiality, informed consent, all of which we might touch on by the time we get to our final panel, and if not, then there's another forum for another day. Just before I let you go and we swap over the three people on the stage, just really quickly, can I ask each of you to respond to this specific point? How different would our discussion be if one of you was a surgeon? Chris? Microphone up.
I'm not sure how to answer that question. They'd say, don't you... Oh, I don't have a good answer, sorry.
Lee?
David can answer first.
Well, I work with surgeons. Yeah. So that's a very strange question, but yeah. So
Well, there's a point to it.
I mean, we couldn't. I couldn't do what I do without surgeons. So if I was a surgeon, I'd be saying I'm really keen to be working with these engineers who are giving me new tools that I can use.
Is that really what you think surgeons would say?
Well, I do know some who might
Some would
come
say
close
that.
to say that.
Yeah. Chris wants to come
Well,
back
and I
to
was just going to follow up from that, one of the conundrums we often face with our epilepsy patients is we'll say, well, the target's roughly here, but the surgeon says, I need more information than that.
Yep.
And if you can, through a new technique, you can pinpoint it down to a very small scale, then you've made surgical options a possibility that were not a possibility.
And obviously what I'm driving at is about the structures of power in the medical and health system, which for so long have been dominated by surgeons. To a hammer, everything's a nail. So, when we talk about how things work, we've got to look at the power structures within the organisations that you will work in. And I think it's fascinating that here you are blowing the top off my head. And traditionally, though, it wouldn't have been engineers and people like that who have that level of expertise in the fields you're working in. So I think it's fantastic. Thank you all very, very much. Could you thank the panel? And if Kate, James and Peter could come up and join us so that we can fly into session 2 before we reward you all with a cup of tea and a Lamington or whatever it might be. So this second session is where we move from what we've just learned about what can be done inside the brain. Now we're looking at beyond the brain. And Kate from the Bionics Institute, as is James, and Peter from the Centre for Eye Research. Let's get you going. And I've got the order of Kate and then James and then Peter. So thank you.
Sounds good. Thank you very much. I just want to assure everyone I have a bit of a cough, but I guarantee you I'm not infectious. It's post-viral, and I'm as excited to see if I can get through this as hopefully everyone here. So we'll see how we go. So I work at the Bionics Institute. I'm head of the cognitive therapeutics program there. And what we're doing is developing and trialling in clinical trials non-invasive brain stimulation to treat cognitive disorders. So just as a little bit of background, which I think, talks to how certainly I got involved in this area and where I think sort of the future is going. So I trained as a clinical neuropsychologist, and during my training and in my early clinical work, I actually became quite frustrated with the lack of treatment options for my patients. So I would see people and talk to them, assess their memory, particularly patients with dementia, explain to them perhaps what was going to happen, what the progression would look like, and then really kind of had to stop talking because there wasn't anything that we could offer. And that's something I found really disheartening. At the same time, I was working on the really early clinical trials of transcranial magnetic stimulation for depression. And during those trials, we observed that we were able to improve memory and that we were able to improve it independently of mood using this technique. And so that kind of set me on the path of investigating techniques like magnetic stimulation and other non-invasive brain stimulations to improve cognition. So transcranial magnetic stimulation is a form of non-invasive brain stimulation. And what we mean by non-invasive is just that we don't do anything inside the head or into the brain. We place a figure of 8 coil over the part of the brain we want to stimulate. Magnetic pulses pass freely into the brain, induce an electrical current, and then we can get the neurons to fire. We do that at very specific parts of the brain. We do that in very specific patterns of firing. And if we do that over and over again, we're able to induce long-term changes in brain function and behaviour. Now, TMS has actually been around for a very long time. It's been studied for 30 years. It was given FDA approval 15 years ago, and we're actually one of the FDA approval for treating depression, sorry, just to clarify that. And Australia is actually one of the only countries in the world that publicly funds TMS for depression. So TMS went on the Medicare benefits schedule in 2021, towards the end of the year. And what that means is that we've got this growing infrastructure of clinical services around the country that offer this treatment. And one of the really beneficial things from my perspective is that, you know, when we look at the future of non-invasive brain stimulation, I think where we're going is expanding to new indications beyond depression, but also improving the techniques themselves. And so for the last 15 years, once I got into this area of research, I've really done a lot of fundamental work looking at trying to find therapeutic brain targets that we want to modulate with stimulation. You know, I really found the previous panel fascinating because a lot of those imaging techniques sound absolutely amazing, and would love to sort of get my hands on some of those to be able to look for new therapeutic targets. And what I mean by that is brain activity that's underlying the specific symptoms that we're trying to modulate with our stimulation. So we've done work in Alzheimer's and in schizophrenia, in Huntington's and head injury as well. What we're doing along the same track of that is looking at the different types of brain stimulation and seeing if they can modulate that activity. If we get a pair that matches up, if we find a specific type of brain stimulation that modulates a specific target, then we'll progress that through to clinical trials. So if I think about the future of brain stimulation or non-invasive brain stimulation, I think there are two sort of key areas that we're particularly interested in, one of which is increasing accessibility so that these techniques are available more widely, and that includes wearable devices as well as home-based stimulation devices. And the other side is personalisation of stimulation. So there's a lot of innovation in this space happening at the moment, but essentially we're really moving away from one size fits all. We want to look at the individual person's brain activity, the specific areas of their brain that we want to stimulate, and then match our stimulation to that activity. And we actually have a personalised magnetic stimulation trial in Alzheimer's that will be starting up at the end of the month. And it will be one of the most personalised magnetic stimulation protocols to date for any indication, and it will be the most personalised Alzheimer's treatment to date. So they're the types of things that that we're really excited about for the future. Okay, I might end it there while I haven't started coughing.
Well done. So it's personalised, but as you build up tens, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of personalised treatments, this is where the machine learning model comes in, and you can start to shortcut the personalisation, can you not?
Absolutely. And look, that's actually really one of the other things I had in mind to mention was, you know, we're developing highly complex protocols for treatment, but we need to be able to translate those to the clinic. So we need things like machine learning. We need things like, machine algorithms to be able to take this complex data and deliver an individual patient's, this is the stimulation frequency you will have, this is the part of the brain we will stimulate. That needs to be really, really seamless. There's no point developing a wonderful treatment that only works in a lab. We have to get it out to patients where it's needed.
Okay, and you're going to be able to solve the problems of ABI, acquired brain injury, by the sound of it.
Acquired brain injury is certainly an area that we've done research in, and we're looking for therapeutic targets. I think one of the historically brain stimulation and non-invasive brain stimulation has gotten a bit of a bad rap, and I think one of the reasons that is that there was a period of time where we just tried it for everything, just a bit randomly. We'll try it for this illness, we'll try it for that illness.
That's what shock treatment used to be.
So shock treatment is or electroconvulsive therapy is certainly a type of this stimulation.
Yeah, and lobotomisation was common if you go back far enough.
Absolutely. And so what's really important in the way in which we do this research and the way in which it's moving is it's very targeted. We don't apply the stimulation and we don't look for a treatment indication unless we can clearly see there's a brain activity that we can modulate that will help someone. So we're looking for that in brain injury, and we're starting to see some interesting signs.
Wow. Okay. James.
Thank you. So I guess today we've heard a lot about the brain, but as Kate mentioned, not all brains are the same. We have individual brains, but more importantly, our brains actually change over time. And so what I want to talk about is the lens that the cochlear implant and deafness and the hearing brain has given us on our understanding of just how plastic and amazing that brain is. I'm also at the Bionics Institute. We were the Bionic Ear Institute, the home of the cochlear implant. University of Melbourne claims that we claim it. Let's just call it even. But I can also proudly say the cochlear implant is actually a little bit rubbish. If you ever listen to a cochlear implant emulator, it's brutal. It's horrible. The first time I heard one, I couldn't understand a word. Now I can listen to it and hear it clearly every single time. I've learnt how to understand what's going on. The only reason the cochlear implant works is because the stuff between our ears is amazing. It is the ultimate pattern recognizing machine. Take the A out of AI is the intelligence in our brain. That's the thing that is the real future. But it's not the same. It's not fixed. It changes over life. One of the most clearest examples is, again, if you look in deaf individuals, their brain physically changes, the way it's organized changes. Normally there's this beautiful organization, it's called the tonotopic organization. Think of a piano keyboard. All the keys laid out there beautifully, low frequency at one end, high frequency at the other. The brain is normally organized like that, well, at least the auditory bit, the really important bit that we all really care about. But if you're deaf from birth, it's disorganized. It's like pressing the bottom key on the piano and hearing the highest note. You press the key in the middle, it's the lowest note. It's completely mucked up. It's completely disorganized if you've never heard. What's required is your brain and your ear to have signals coming in for that organization to develop over time. How do we know this? Because when we provide cochlear implants, we can see the brain reorganize in front of our very eyes if you do the right kind of imaging. So you can see the brain reorganize to that input. It's amazing. But only if you do it early in life. If you do it too late in life, the brain becomes a little bit fixed, which is why we aim to implant kids as young as we can. The record, I believe, is still about 3 months old. And, you know, imagine putting a cochlear implant in a 3-month-old baby. They're tiny, but their brains are the best brains to give a cochlear implant to, because they will suck up that information and become the world's best performers. If you hear kids implanted that young, you don't even realise they've got a cochlear implant. You wouldn't know from talking to them or listening to them. So that's amazing. The other thing that's really interesting is it's not just one brain. You know, we often talk about two brains, the left brain and the right brain. Our brain processes things very differently. In particular in the auditory world, we're really good at separating where sounds come from in space. We have 2 ears for a reason. Lets us tell where the sounds come from. In an environment like this where it's just me talking, it's really easy to listen to me, hopefully, apart from my accent and my tendency to mumble a little bit. But in a crowded environment, when we're having our cup of tea in Scone or Lamington later, you'll be doing an awful lot of sound processing to extract the person you're trying to listen to out of that hubbub that's going on. We do that for free. We don't even think about doing it. It's our lower brain structures to do that. But again, we lose the ability to do that if we don't experience that early in life. We actually lose the ability to do that. We can give you people who have grown up deaf, we can give them that right signal late in life, and they simply cannot do that processing. The brain has changed. So, I mean, think about that. The brain is changing dramatically. The other thing to think about is it doesn't have to be quite as severe as a profoundly deaf individual. Given the number of people in this room, I'll put a fair bit of money on that. At least several individuals in here who have tinnitus. That ringing in the ears you hear in the absence of any other noise. One of the things that is most associated with that is a slight, mild to moderate hearing loss, a sound exposure. And really, the best hypothesis of what's going on now is basically it's the brain is trying to listen to that patch of your cochlea that's no longer responding, that bit of your ear that's no longer responding to sound, and basically it turns up that volume, trying to hear something coming from there. It's desperate to hear the input from there, and when it can't, it basically just makes stuff up. And therefore, when there is no sound, you're still hearing sound. That your brain has changed in response to it. So again, that's a horrible thing to have happened. Along with Kate, we're trying to develop some treatments for that, which we can talk to you about later. So, you know, so far I've told you about all the horrible things that happens to your brain. But there's a plus side. As I said, if you implant early in life, you get fantastic results with the cochlear implant. The other thing is sometimes that bit of your brain that's not being used for processing sound can be used for something else. So in fact, if you do some very special visual acuity tasks, people who are profoundly deaf have higher visual acuity on certain tasks than they do their normal hearing colleagues. That's because their brain that was going to be used for sound is now actually doing vision processing. So we can actually improve our ability. We can get super normal abilities with the right kind of training. And that's my final thing that I often like to talk about is nowadays if you get a cochlear implant, they cost roughly the same as a new hip. If you get a new hip or a new knee, so I'm told, haven't had to have one yet, touch wood, you can't leave hospital until you've done an awful lot of rehabilitation, until you can climb stairs, until you can walk well, then they'll let you out. You get a cochlear implant, we just let you loose. We send you home, very little rehab goes on, but we still do amazingly well just because of how important language is. But imagine if for every one of these kind of things where we're trying to interact with the brain, we had tailored training programs, tailored regimes, where we could actually maximise the ability of the brain to take use of that information. I think that's really one of the things we need to think about in terms of the future of the brain, is using the brain to its best ability.
So you use your powers for good. What happens when these powers are used for evil?
Do you have a particular evil in mind, John?
Yeah, Clockwork Orange, sort of syndrome. If people don't know the film, in a nutshell, reprogramming the neural pathways in order to achieve a particular social outcome.
Certainly is not impossible. Certainly we hope that doesn't happen. But I guess
Hope is not going to get us far.
Hope is not going to go as far, but that is equally why, as mentioned earlier, it's all about the ecosystem. So if you let the engineers loose, you'll probably end up with Clockwork Orange. If you have the engineers with the ethicists...
The engineers over there who are laughing.
That'll be me as well. I'm an engineer. That's
like you can make that joke.
Yeah. So it's the ecosystem. It's the societal norms, and you mentioned earlier about the cost disparities. I mean, that's another thing we worry about too. Cochlear implants are not cheap, and so we like to give people 2 cochlear implants because they've got 2 ears. Should you give half the number of people 2 or more people 1? These are questions that are
Sure.
difficult, and to be honest, as an engineer, I'm not the best person to be asking.
No. Okay, so if people who can see but can't hear, their brain works in a certain way, then you teach them to hear, it changes the way their brain works. Does that diminish the skills that they'd acquired when their brain was fully working on the other senses? Do they then compromise the superpowers they used to have?
The brain is the classic use it or lose it. So if they don't continue to do it, they will undoubtedly lose it. However, if they continue to practice that skill, there's every reason to suspect they would maintain that skill.
So when I was at law school, I had a lecturer who was blind, and you had to submit your essays on tape, and he would listen to them at triple speed. It's Ron McCallum, if people know who he was. He's an extraordinary man. No one else could understand a word of it. But he could assess, and anyone else would check the same essays and come up with exactly the same conclusions. So he didn't want to lose his superpower.
No, and so but he probably shouldn't get a bionic eye, which we also try and work on and invent. And to me, it's the very, we are all different. We all have different abilities, and perhaps we should focus as much on enhancing those different special abilities than trying to make everybody the same. And so this is where cochlear implants aren't for everyone, bionic eyes aren't for everyone. It's all about customising what the patient wants, what the individual wants to maximise their life and their outcomes.
Has anyone been fitted with a bionic? Well, bionic eyes are still in development. So what would happen if you wanted to fit a bionic ear and a bionic eye?
You'd have a lot of stuff on your head. No one's tried that to date. There's no fundamental reason why you couldn't. And presumably you'd be very keen to, because without either of them you can't hear or see, and therefore that can be quite isolating. So I suspect you'd probably opt for one rather than the other, just because it would also be an awful lot of new sensory input to have to deal with. And so maximising input from one may be a better option than trying to get an okay response from 2.
Okay, we're halfway through and my brain's already exploding, so there we go. Peter.
Full disclosure, I'm an eye surgeon, so you'll get to hear a little bit from a surgeon, but a rather unorthodox one, because I also consider myself to be a neuroscientist. I lead a group of engineers and physicists who collaborate widely with data scientists and astrophysicists, looking at new ways to image the eye to get insights into the brain. But to sort of understand that connection, I'll state a pretty obvious fact that a large part of the way in which we interact with the world is through sight. A picture is worth 1,000 words or more. And if you look at neuroanatomy, we've heard a lot about that this evening. Much of the brain is devoted to processing vision, and a large part is also devoted to coordinating our eye movements, because for us to get good binocular vision, we need precise control of our eye movements. And in fact, the most precisely defined movements of any part of the body is in the eyes there. They're moving sideways, up and down, torting, and changing as we change our focal distance. So it's an exquisite example of control. And if you think about the visual system, the eye is really like a high-speed broadband information conduit. You know, this way that we interact with the world. And so we get tremendous insights about the brain if we look and start to interrogate the eye and its movements. But just to underscore the first point there, I don't know if anyone saw the release for Apple's latest product, Vision Pro. I think that really exemplifies that point that the eye is just so important as a conduit to our brain that now the future of computing is getting away from hands and voice, and it's all just going to the eye. That product is a augmented reality system which is fated as the future of spatial computing, and it has motion sensors and pupil detectors, and now you can browse the internet without moving a hand, which is profound, but I think it exemplifies that point. So how is this all relevant to health? Because that's why we're here. Well, we can use those insights to gain information about the health of the brain. And John gave us a perfect segue this evening with his head injury. So if we think about traumatic brain injury, there's about 1 million episodes in the States each year of kids on the sporting field getting mild concussion. The way in which we can assess the impact of that on the brain is becoming increasingly important, because we see that chronic re-injury leads to long-term neurodegeneration, which can be devastating. We've had a few really celebrated AFL footballers who've faced that. So measuring vision and pupil responses and eye movements are now all fields of discovery and innovation, so that on the sidelines of the sporting field we can now look at an athlete's pupil responses, their eye movements. We can actually measure very simply the speed of conduction from a visual stimulus to the time it's received in the brain with visual evoked potentials, and we can combine those to get a very, very accurate objective indicator of the extent of brain injury. So that's a good example. We can also use similar approaches to get insights into psychiatric conditions, schizophrenia, by looking at characteristic gaze patterns that's been known about since the early 1900s. We can look at attentional behaviours in autism, for instance, noting that people with autism tend to avoid eye contact with the person that they're speaking to's eyes. They tend to focus on the mouth. So you can get insights into diagnosis of disease. The thing that my group's really interested in is looking at the retina. So the retina is the neural tissue that lines the inside of the eye. It's the wallpaper inside the eye. And it develops in all vertebrates as an extension of the brain. So it grows out of the brain. It's the only part of the brain that we can optically image. And we heard about the fantastic resolution of MRI scans and the like, but I can say that the average ophthalmologist has at their disposal in their routine practice instruments that can image the nervous system an order of magnitude higher than the very best state-of-the-art brain scan. So we can optically image the brain on a stalk, if you like. So one of the things that my team was interested in doing is trying to apply this technology to diagnose brain diseases, and in particular Alzheimer's disease. We know that in Alzheimer's there's the accumulation of waste products in the brain, proteins that are very sticky and hang around, amyloid and phosphorylated tau, as biomarkers of that disease process. It turns out they're also deposited in the retina. And so we have been using a satellite imaging technology, which was first developed by NASA to image the Earth from space, using different wavelengths of light and studying the interaction of those different wavelengths or colours of light with the tissue to give us a specific signal for Alzheimer's disease. And we were the first group in the world to publish that we could detect a signal that correlated with the load of amyloid in the brain just by imaging the retina. And we're now looking at Parkinson's disease, because there's another protein that gets deposited there called alpha-synuclein, which also has a unique signature when we image this way, and also for tau, the other protein that's implicated in Alzheimer's. So I think there's a huge frontier where perhaps we can get novel insights into brain health by imaging the eye and studying eye movements and pupil function.
Wow, we'll throw it open to your questions in a moment. Just a few from me before we get there. it's almost like you're a witch. And a lot of popular mythology, going back in no matter which culture, anywhere, anthropologists, sociologists, if there's any in the room, will tell us, almost all cultures have got the same approach of looking into people's eyes. So we're just coming round again.
I think so. I mean, I think we neglect the wisdom of our elders at our own peril. You know, there's a reason why. But I think it does come back to that original point that so much of our interaction with the world is through sight.
Okay, but with the help of NASA.
Yeah.
So we're marrying old concepts with the absolute cutting edge technology.
Yeah. And
so, cheap jokes aside, what we're doing is we're taking military and space research and applying it to health.
yeah, and in fact, many of the data, because this is a big data challenge, as we've heard about several times this evening, many of the things that have been learnt over many decades in astrophysics and astronomy are very relevant to the data challenges that we're facing here. So we've had very productive collaborations with astrophysicists, taking what they do on the macro scale to the micro scale in the eye.
And again, then, just before we get to first questions over here, if we can get a mic to this third row back here, we talk about space research and the space industry, and stupid people like me think, oh, it's about putting rockets up. What's the point? There's plenty up there already. But in fact, there's a dividend for this extraordinary conglomeration that we have here in Melbourne of medical research. You've kind of got to add that weapon. Sorry, you've got to add that tool to your kit.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Absolutely. And I can say as a researcher, there's nothing more satisfying than getting a group of very smart people from different disciplines together for a shared purpose. And what we found very early on was that the astrophysicists have a real hunger to make a difference to people. You know, they're doing all these amazing discoveries, but it may never change anything for anyone. So there's a huge appetite.
Okay. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4. Lots of questions. Let's go.
Hi, my question is for Peter specifically. I'm just a Uni Melbourne student, by the way. I was really interested in what you're talking about, the role of like eyes and eye movement, and was wondering if there were any potential future like psychiatric implications of that, because we have EMDR now, which is, using the rapid eye movement for people to process trauma in cases of PTSD. I was wondering if you knew if there was anything being expanded upon that body of research.
I think there's just this vast frontier. These are very complex fields that we're starting to now understand with the application of machine learning to really interrogate this. So I think it's got huge potential from a diagnostic capacity. I'm not sure if it can then translate to working out therapeutic efficacy. So if you start someone on a treatment, are you going to see normalization of some of those abnormalities? That's probably the next area that we'll spread into.
Okay. Anyone else? No? Good. At the back there, yes. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Matthew Kang. I'm one of the psychiatrists and research fellows at the Neuropsychiatry Service. My question's for Kate. You mentioned about the skepticism with TMS beforehand, and something that's played out in psychiatry, especially clinicians. How do you see overcoming that in the future with these sort of innovative treatments, in convincing these clinicians to try it out, to believe in the research?
Yeah, look, I think it's a good point. I think I think what we can do is really just show the weight of evidence. It requires us to do gold standard research, to do our research well, to publish and to talk to people, to go out to the clinician groups and explain the results, and just to make it really clear. I think that TMS works. There's no question TMS works. We've got an avalanche of information, and I can guarantee you, having been involved in the process peripherally of the Medicare benefit schedule, they're not going to give you that money if you can't actually have the evidence that it's effective for people. So I really just think it's about doing the best research we can, but also really communicating with clinicians and bringing clinicians in at every point. to be involved in the development and the testing of these techniques. You need to bring them along the journey as well.
It's not unreasonable to ask you to be able to show the success of the treatment before it's publicly funded, is it?
Absolutely not.
Yeah. There's any number of people who have any number of sometimes pretty wild ideas they'd like to get funding for.
Yes, and the bar should be very high.
Yeah.
Very, very high. Yes, and I guess my point was that having gone through that process, the bar is high.
Yeah.
And so that's how we can be confident in its effects.
Okay. Is it so high, though, that it discourages the development of new techniques?
No, I don't think necessarily. I think that, TMS had been developed and even translated well before the MBS scheduling. It becomes an issue of access. So it's about the how high the bar is to get broader public access.
Okay, I've got 1, 2, 3 still to come.
Good.
Yeah, you're on.
Amanda Gilligan. I'm actually a neurologist and associate professor of the University of Melbourne and Epworth and Austin. Kate, a quick aside, one quick question for you. When we did a clinical trial in TMS in epilepsy many years ago, observationally, half of the controls got pregnant. And I'm just wondering whether... No, serendipitous discovery is...
Barry White was playing in the background.
Thank you. I was just going to say the fertility train is a possibility, but one complete aside to that, we have got a big room of people involved in research here. I am so proud at international meetings to stand up and see Australians represented in so many fields of neuroscience. We are extraordinarily blessed in the international stage. One of the things that is clear is the determination with which we pursue our research. And I would want everyone to make some comment. How do you get over the barriers? Because I remember the first PET scanner that Sandberg put into the Austin, and they went, what a ridiculous expensive white elephant. Same when Graham Jackson looked at getting the MRI scanner for research purposes. Same when we will look at the bionic ear, everything. There are skeptics everywhere. What advice do you give to researchers coming through about fighting the skepticism?
Can I just deal with the pregnancy one real quick?
Yeah.
Sorry.
I'm really worried about Barry White being the knee-jerk default reaction.
I just want to, wow. And no, that's not. No, look, we've given TMS to probably literally in the thousands of people now, and TMS is speaking to and that's nothing that's come up before. I've personally had TMS hundreds and hundreds of times without...
Excuse the play on words, it probably depends on your stimulation profile.
I think that may have been an outstanding coincidence. Yes, but just not a known side effect of TMS, I can guarantee.
Anyone else, quickly?
Just to respond to that question, I think it's really standing on the shoulders of those giants that you mentioned. I mean, we have so many great exemplars of people who've pushed the barriers, and having that really proximate in Melbourne, I think is hugely empowering.
Okay, over here.
Hello, my name's Tegan. I'm a clinical neuropsychology registrar at Alfred. Kate, I'm sorry, I'm going to bring it back to you with your poor voice, but
okay.
I'm currently working predominantly in mental health and seeing a lot of patients with schizophrenia. And I note when you're talking about TMS, it's often done in adults looking for that specific therapeutic target. But I'm wondering, given what we know about people having very high genetic risks and having a very long cognitive prodrome, whether there's sort of hope and scope to move towards almost preventative stimulation.
Absolutely.
Sorry, what do you mean by prevent? Just to clarify, do you mean predicting people?
Not necessarily predicting, but like knowing people who are very high risk and then might have drops to cognition, specifically things like auditory, verbal memory. Can we sort of target that early so that they don't have that drop in their teens?
Yeah, absolutely, and so that's something we've certainly looked at in dementia. So we haven't analysed the data, but we've done an at-home stimulation trial in people with mild cognitive impairment, which is a known risk factor for dementia. And so we do a trial, and then we follow those people through to see if providing the stimulation, which essentially what we're doing is we're trying to drive connectivity in the brain, the connectivity that we know underlies things like cognition, to the point where we're bringing the brain into sort of healthy regions. So we're trying to initiate and maintain a healthy brain. And if we do that, can the brain get better at staving off the various insults that we have as we age? Again, with schizophrenia and the clear prodrome that you have in that illness, yes, that would be a potential window. If we could find the right therapeutic target, and if we know we can change it with the stimulation, then yeah, that's absolutely a possibility.
Just look into their eyes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Last question, and then we've got a cup of tea.
I have two questions. One's very short.
Well,
I want to know how this stuff gets out to the public. We mostly see kind of short grabs from the news. How does it get out to the person in the street? That was for Kate. That was just a short one.
Cheeky, yeah.
In this case, I'm a lived experience person in that I have myasthenia gravis, optical myasthenia gravis, which is not, I presume, a brain issue. It's more an autoimmune thing, but it affects all those small muscles. What's the separation between the chemicals of such things and the small muscles that come from the brain?
I assume that's for Peter.
That was for Peter, yes.
Yeah, so why don't I take that one first? So myasthenia gravis, you're making an antibody, an autoantibody against one of the mediators of the signalling between the brain and the actual muscle. So it's happening at the signal processing end, at the end at the muscle. So it's not the brain, it's actually at the junction between the nerve and the muscle. So there's a communication problem there.
Okay, and on the first question, I'm going to ask each of you, how do we get this stuff out to the point where the public know what 100 people in the room here know?
It's a really good question. So whenever we do a research project, we develop something called a dissemination plan, where we try to plan out how do we get this information as far as we can. So yes, we have to publish and go to conferences and talk to each other, but it's just as important to speak to everybody. So events like this, we certainly do. I do regular talks at community events. Every scientist I know is usually more than happy to go out and talk to community events. We do media where we can. We do. I think we do as much science communication, the majority of us, as we can. But we are all individuals, so sometimes it takes a long time for the information to really, permeate through society to everyone.
James?
Obviously, all those things. But the other thing I would echo, though, is, again, as an engineer, I don't get to directly impact anybody's life. The work I do can, if it gets out into the right hands. And for a long time, commercial was a dirty word, but actually commercialisation equals clinical impact in this world, in this sphere. So all these bionic eyes, all these bionic ears, all those great neural brain interfaces help no one, or they help the 6 people who are in the trial. That's not getting out in the world. They need to be commercialised. They need to get out in the world, and that's how I think we can actually disseminate it more broadly, more widely, because when they're out there helping people's lives, that's when they're out there.
It's almost like what's coming in the next session, isn't it? Who'd have thought? Yes, sorry.
Just two points to add. Number one, I think we also have to sort of temporise our enthusiasm as scientists. We're constantly pushing the virtues of what we're doing. We have a responsibility to give a reasonable indication of timelines and probabilities of this actually reaching the world, because there are very high bars set. So that's just one word of pause. The other thing to say is, it's amazing that we still live in a world where the Kardashians are household names, and yet most people couldn't name a scientist. And I think it's our responsibility to try and change that, and through events like this that we can do that. So, we have 2 of the new rock stars of the world here.
3. So what we've also got, though, is we've now heard from 6 of our 9 panellists, and the next 3 will be just as mind-boggling. It's almost like you were in a competition or a race for resources and funds and attention. I'm being cheeky. You are in a race for resources, for funds, for brain power of students and researchers and all the rest of it. Having heard the previous 3, they don't have the advantage you have of responding to them. Which do you think is more likely to give us some quick bang for our buck? Kate? Do you reckon they've got the answers better than you, or do you think yours is better than theirs?
I couldn't do what I'm doing without them.
Okay.
And I don't say that facetiously. This isn't about, eventually you're going to run out of ideas or you're going to run out of tech. You know, you have the clinicians and the patients who identify the problems, the researchers who develop the, you know, ideas and the new treatments to test, and then you need the engineers and the scientists at all levels to come together. So I think if you try and sort of do one over the other, you're going to hit a brick wall at some point.
Mm-hmm.
But if you all work together, then yeah, that's not going to happen.
Are you as generous, James?
I am. I'd maybe even go one step further and say it's not a zero-sum game either. Like 1 + 1 equals fantastic results. 1 competing against 1 equals nobody wins. So I think the sooner we get away from this competition attitude and more towards the collaborative attitude, that is when we'll make huge gains.
Yeah, and I'd bring it back to space. So, you know, to get the ISS into orbit didn't take just great rocket engineers or great computer scientists to work out trajectories and great engineers to work out habitats in space. It required all of them. And I think, you know, the audacious challenge of understanding the brain and then treating disorders of the brain requires, you know, strength on all fronts.
Wow. Well, it's been fantastic to kickstart the discussion, and then we're going to bring it home with our next panel. But first you get the reward of a piece of cake and a cup of tea. We've only set 10 minutes aside for this, so I'd ask you please to, well, not form a crush, but an orderly crush. But we will try and keep it to time, so if we start the next session on time, we finish on time. Thank you very much. Could you thank the panellists? Hey, our final session is now looking at the ethical, legal and commercial considerations. And it was the perfect segue, wasn't it? All of this is fine. You can't keep it to yourself. So Damien, Shannon and Jeannie will take us through, and then again, we'll have time for questions at the end. Thanks, Damien. Oh, sure.
I think all three of us are going to do this.
Oh,
I'm sorry to push you off.
It's all right.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, thank you for allowing me to speak tonight on behalf of the prosecution. My name's Damien Kenny. I'm the Chief of Staff at CM Medical. We're a resident in the building here. We've helped 15,000 patients so far get a differential diagnosis of epilepsy at home rather than in a hospital. We've helped them get that within weeks rather than years. We've done that for every dollar that we've charged, we've saved $5 to the health system. We've done this with university commercialised IP, and we do this because we build stakeholder support. Now, I have to say to you that today, my contention is that the current timidity in the reform of ethical, legal and commercial arrangements in Australia makes us all guilty of blocking vital disruption in brain health. So, we heard today expert witnesses. We heard from them that brain health is approaching a major inflection point. It is within our grasp to arrest cognitive decline and dramatically transform cerebral capabilities of the human race. We heard about the stent road. We heard about seizure forecasting. We know that our future could be extremely bright. Augmented with new technology, devices and treatments, we can repair and maintain the bridge between our brains and our bodies, our eyes. We can help people who are paralysed communicate with computers. We can help them to walk again. In short, with these technologies, if we get out of their way, we should expect to lead healthier lives for longer. Now, the defence are going to tell you that we don't need to do that. Everything's pretty good and we need to be protected. That actually, if we push on, consumer privacy might be jeopardised. They're going to tell you that it's better to stay paralysed and seated and not able to access these technologies because your privacy might be infringed. I've got to say, are we going to stand for that? I'm going to ask you to get angry with me by the end of this, and I will try and stick to 2 more minutes. So, in this world, brain health is going to fail. we're not going to achieve this wonderful thing, this bright future, because our health spending will be contained, constrained, and controlled towards other priorities. And the bickering between stakeholders and rivalrous groups will stop us from getting anywhere. You'd like to think that the quality of our rock star researchers would enable us to avail ourselves of these new disruptions. Modern Albert Einsteins, Marie Curie's, Graham Clark's should save us. But, alas, if we don't confront the stakeholder wars, we won't get there. Power and incentives drive diverse stakeholders in different directions. It's as plain and simple as that. This current system of ethics, legal constraints, and commercial arrangements, unless we get angry and commit to reforming and to change, if we are timid and we just allow iteration, we will limp along and we will not get anything like the benefits that we were looking for. Stakeholder wars determine who prevails. Stakeholder wars determine who fails and who is locked out. Venture capital, I'm glad someone said earlier, can be a dirty word. Who else is going to fund this? If you're a venture capitalist and you're looking for a return right now, thank you to the victim impact statements we heard, right? All those wonderful things that are not going to get past the labs and out of this university and out into the field. Without capital, those things will never make the impact that they deserve to. In venture capital, you need to spend $200 million to create a business that will be worth $1.5 billion down the track. That's your bet. Am I going to put that bet into helping build a new brain-computer interface with a regulatory environment that locks me out, that makes it difficult? Or am I going to put that into a better software platform that helps me to track my social media contacts? So my closing argument is this: we must not allow the incumbents to use their market power and their incumbency to build moats to protect legacy business models and business approaches that sacrifice your better brain health. Thank you.
So, Damien, you do have a microphone there. Henry Ford argued against regulating the motor vehicle. He didn't want us to have road rules because he said that will inhibit the benefit of my invention of the mass-produced motor car. He said it from a position of absolute self-interest. Isn't that what you're doing too?
Thank you very much for the question. We're not at the point of being a monopolist in our space. We're not a dominant player, and we're not looking to lock anyone out. We want a field of innovation that everyone can, have a go in. Absolutely, there's a need for a system of coordinating, a system of rules. There is the best thing that happened to the motor vehicle is probably the system of rules by which we had traffic lights and other interventions. So absolutely an appropriate light touch arrangement.
So you've just completely destroyed your own argument.
No, my argument is that the current system stands in the way of
So
meaningful disruption.
It's too dampening.
We need to get really, really zealous about reform.
Okay. And then you argue that it's only venture capital that can provide the solutions. Who invented Wi-Fi?
The venture capital reference was one example of a stakeholder that will step up and make a meaningful contribution. We all build on our social capital, previous investments in universities like this. A lot of our work comes from CSIRO. I think CSIRO is the
CSIRO invented Wi-Fi. Yeah.
Right, I'll stick to the answer.
Yeah.
CSIRO.
No. So, but you're right. I mean, the point I'm making is that it's not just venture capital that can contribute these huge leaps from time to time.
100%.
Yeah. Okay. So your two main arguments. No, I don't need to do that. That's cruel. Shannon.
Folks of all ages, I may look somewhat young now, but it's not going to last forever. Right now, I'm in my prime. I'm at the Center for AI and Digital Ethics, led by Professor Jeannie Patterson over here, and I study the risks of technologies and the things that could go wrong. But one day I might be looking for something else. Melbourne Uni might put me out on the street, and then I'll wake up in the morning with a bit of a headache, and I'll take off my skull cap electrodes. They'll hopefully have resolved my headache. I'll take my personalized brain medication to prevent any further decline. After all, that's what Melbourne Uni got rid of me for. And I will go and I will look for a new job. And I put in my application online, and they ask for something new. They ask for my brain print. And so I go on my phone, I send it over. My personality has been carefully tabulated, my future laid out in ones and zeros, and off to the job it goes. 30 seconds later, I get another email. We thank you for your application, but your brain has been denied. So with this distressing information, I decide to go for a little walk. And cameras are panning everywhere, our facial recognition tech has identified me, and I'm stopped by the police. It seems that I'm a near match for a potential crime in the area. So they take me down to the police station, and we heard from Professor Johnston that there's a new technology that's on the market. In fact, the researchers at the University of Austin came out with this Nature paper that we heard about, and the police have got a hold of it. So they put me into the fMRI, and they read me a bunch of podcasts, and then at the end, they ask me, where were you last Thursday at 7 p.m? And my brain thinks, not at the bank, not at the bank, not at the bank. And up on the police screen, on the fancy fMRI machine that's now run through all of its algorithms, it comes up, at the bank. The word not was missing. So my day after being fired from Melbourne Uni, and thankfully my headache's gone, but now I'm in a cell on my own, jobless and penniless. This is the future of brain health that those for the prosecution are arguing that we should have in the absence of any regulation around privacy and security. These devices have the potential to bring us great benefits, to solve many problems that we currently face today. But unfortunately, if left unregulated and unchecked by the ethical norms that we already do have today in society, they could take us down a fairly dark path. Now, this may seem dystopic, but already we're seeing instances where consumer privacy is being violated to significant detriment of individuals. Now, I, like many of you, was with a certain Australian telco provider until a few months ago when all our data was leaked. And while I personally did not experience any identity theft, I personally know many individuals whose data was leaked. And so these risks aren't just theoretical, they're very practical. And as we give access to more and more sophisticated data, and as the machine learning algorithms that process our data become more sophisticated, the risks do too. And so what I'm standing here arguing as a member of the defense today is not that we shouldn't build these technologies. These things have wonderful potential, from personalized therapies to diagnostics that serve as early warning signals. I'm merely suggesting that the forms of regulation that we know and love today, such as the Privacy Act that protects us using a set of broad principles, be retained and be applied to the brain technologies of the future. And with that, I will leave it to my the last speaker for the defensive team to argue that these products need to be appropriately regulated. Thank you.
So privacy's dead?
Well, it might be if the prosecution gets their way. Look, I think
but don't we give away more information voluntarily every day than the alarmists say is being collected by the police state?
So there is a bright side to it. We do have technologies that can step in and help put a barrier between the information we need to have processed and the places it goes. So there are ways to process data potentially more locally, but this also requires strong incentives for these technologies to be used. So as long as we have an adequate system of regulation that incentivizes companies to use technologies that keep our data within our own devices or that perform processing that is private, we can both get the benefits of the technologies, but also be assured that we're living in the kind of world that we all want to live in.
And if you're so worried about the capacity of machines to make mistakes, I think Kathleen Folbig would probably have preferred a machine than a jury.
So it is. People make mistakes, and the argument is not that we should bar any use of these technologies, nor that there aren't instances even where human practitioners or even human, well, I shouldn't say the engineers because I'm one of them, but where there aren't places where it would be sensible to replace certain aspects of human judgment with algorithmic analysis. However, the argument is that that should be mediated carefully and that there should be humans in the loop as appropriate to make sure that the machines don't get out of hand. I may have seen one too many sci-fi movies, but that scenario leaves me with nightmares.
Then which is worse, algorithmic bias or human bias?
I think that there are different types of bias. We tend to be more comfortable with human bias just from there's a certain emotive sense. We can connect to a person who's doing us wrong, which may be cold comfort, but there are a large number of studies that show when you get the same level of bias from a machine, people react much more negatively. And so it's not clear that that's actually something we should try to fight. Perhaps it is reasonable in some instances for people to be comfortable with other people because even when they're biased, because then we can make appeals to certain human aspects that we can't appeal to when it's a machine making the decision. So if it's a biased human in front of us, we can say, you know, this decision is wrong. We can ask them to explain their decision in a clear and transparent way. And in many instances, at least with the algorithms that we have today, that's not as much a possibility.
All right, we've heard from the prosecution and the defence. Now Judge Jeannie.
I'm really sorry to disappoint you, John. I'm not Judge Jeannie. The side of law and order can afford two counsel. So you've heard from Shannon Cooney, KC, King's Counsel, and now I'm his junior to round off the arguments. So he's the amusing one and I'm the boring. I'm the serious one, I'm afraid, and I know I'm the last speaker, so I'm sorry. Just buckle down for a bit of doom and gloom. My apologies. Sometimes, surprisingly to me, innovators think lawyers and the law are impediments. Lawyers on this view escalate risk and constrain the vision and creativity of engineers and innovators. Or worse, lawyers represent the interests of big tech and big pharma who have captured the regulatory agenda. And note that the defence team has two counsel. Might ask how that came about, but I'll leave that for the moment. I'm actually going to suggest that view, that cynical view, is an impoverished view of the law, and one that arises only if innovators innovate first and think later. At its heart, law is embodiment of Kantian ethics. And Kantian ethics say do not treat people as a means to your own ends. Respect the unique nature and the individuality of every single person. That's what the law embodies, at least at its best. Let's think about this by way of an example. The law of negligence and the law of product liability apply to professionals and manufacturers who interact with ordinary people, so doctors and engineers, let's say, and require them to compensate those who are injured where there is a lack of reasonable care. And the role of the law there is actually to incentivise those people to take care to make sure accidents don't happen. And if they do happen, to compensate the individual who's injured, to respect the individual who should not be a means to the ends of others. Does the law penalise sound and careful science? No. The standard of care required by the law is the standard of the prudent practitioner, who does measured peer-reviewed research that we've just heard about. But surely, you might say, professionals and manufacturers act in that way anyway, and they don't need heavy-handed law and regulation to require them to do that. Generally they do, but not always. The origins of product liability law were in the harms caused by the drug thalidomide, approved as a sedative, painkiller and treatment for morning sickness in pregnant women. And if you want to know about who doesn't get tested or thought about in many clinical trials, in many countries, it's pregnant women. During the trials of thalidomide, from 1957 to 1961, 10,000 children in 46 countries were born with serious congenital deformities. The trial was, that happened because the trial was not because the drug wasn't tested, but then it wasn't recalled once the problems emerged. Which country did not have a problem with the thalidomide? The United States of America, because their federal drug agency refused to approve the drug because it had not been properly tested. Fast forward to last year, and you may think that these horrors of thalidomide and untested drugs are a thing of the past. I'm afraid they're not. Last year, we had a decision concerning pelvic mesh provided by the Ethicon companies, members of Johnson & Johnson, and have a look how many product liabilities are against that particular company, I might add. The products in question were tension-free vaginal tape for the treatment of urinary stress incontinence and the treatment of pelvic organ prolapse in women. Again, the product had never been tested on women. It was approved for something quite differently. It was established at trial that the products carried risks of serious injury, including chronic inflammatory reactions, extrusion or erosion of the mesh into surrounding organs, infection, chronic pain and other side effects. Basically, the mesh is absorbed into the body and then can't be removed. Ethicon was found liable under Australia's product liability regime and in negligence. They breached their duty of care by failing to conduct any clinical trials on the people who were going to use it, bringing the product to market with unseemly haste, a lack of attention to the safety of women who would use the device, and no ongoing evaluation of the safety and effectiveness of the device after its release in Australia, the UK, Europe, and so on. Now, imagine the same lack of care in some form of implantable brain device, or indeed imagine the same lack of care in any form of brain imaging that attempts to identify disorders of the brain. We've been thinking about disorders of the brain that clearly require attention. My sister has epilepsy, so I was in tears over the story. But imagine we decide that children are too rowdy in school and we want them to be quieter. What happens if we run medical imaging on their brains and work out which drugs or which part of the brain can produce quiet, compliant students? The Einsteins and the Marie Curies and the inventors of the past were probably the ratty, annoying students in class, precisely the ones we don't want to be made quiet. Now, all of the examples I've given you are actually examples of big tech gone bad, not prudent, sensible university researchers that I've heard of from day. So I'm going to say to you, we need law and regulation. The law is an embodiment of an ethical principle of respect. But it is possible, and I will concede this, that we need precision regulation, just as we need precision medical treatment. And precision regulation would look at who's doing the research, how large they are, what their reputation is. And I think that might be the answer forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge Jeannie, and I'll look for questions from the floor in just a moment. Wave to me, we'll get microphones to you, you know the drill. So isn't your argument, though, somewhat undone by the example you've given, because you're calling for regulation, then you use pelvic mesh as an example, but that's an area that is already heavily regulated, but it didn't prevent that problem. No, it didn't prevent. Microphone.
Sorry.
Technology, I know it's annoying.
I know, it's so hard for a lawyer. It didn't prevent the problem, but in general, Australia's product safety regime is product safety history is pretty good, and it didn't prevent the problem arising, but it also gave compensation to the women who were harmed, and it's made Australian regulators look very careful in the use of the pelvic mesh was using the EU mark, which indicated that it had been approved in the EU for medical use. And in fact, that mark had been fraudulently attached.
What, totally fraudulently?
Yeah, pretty much. Yep, they hadn't done the testing. They just plonked it on.
It's like Chinese imported building materials that are certified asbestos-free when they're not.
Correct. So the regime, you can look at it half full, half empty. This is a horrible example. The regime doesn't stop all things going wrong, but it can tell you it's made a lot of attention applied to products that say that they have been approved in the EU, and I think probably raise the bar again in Australia for what gets onto the market without scrutiny.
Okay, isn't some regulatory lag inevitable? Inevitably, things will come to market before there can be the response, the regulatory response.
Well, the thing is, we have this thing called the law of negligence. Now, the law of negligence used to be called delict. It's been around from Roman times. My husband, who is actually a Roman, a classicist, said there's almost no problem that we face in Australia in modern times that hasn't actually been thought about in historical law. And that's a very Eurocentric example, and I know that there would be other examples in other cultures. But if you come back to the basic driving point, and we tend to think about the law as stopping us doing things. The law is about respecting individuals and taking care. It's about respecting our neighbour or respecting our colleagues or respecting our family and doing things that are not going to harm them. Now, that's not a hard idea, and it doesn't matter whether you're doing it with an early motor car or an AI algorithm, which is just a tool as well. The law says to us, take care, respect each other. Don't harm people for your own ends.
So don't we come back to where we were earlier on about using powers for good and evil? If the good, well-behaved countries operate in a strictly regulated environment, there will be other countries that don't regulate, that don't wait, that aren't ethical, and will adopt some of these technologies to use against us.
Johnson & Johnson is an American company. We think America is a highly regulated company. Johnson & Johnson makes talcum powder. Talcum powder causes cancer of the uterus if you put talcum powder between your legs to keep them to stop sweating between the thighs, it can cause cancer. That's been found out in the US. And so where's Johnson & Johnson selling talcum powder? In India. Now, that's the reverse of what you've just suggested, if you like. It's the supposedly well-regulated country doing bad things in other countries. So I think instead of worrying about rogue countries, we should probably look in our own backyards and make sure they're in order, to be honest.
Okay. We've got one question over here, looking for more, and we've got plenty of time to chew these issues over before we wind up around about past. Go ahead, thank you.
Mr. Kenny, we had recent PET prostate therapies developed here in our precinct at Peter Mac, right, which have revolutionised prostate cancer. That was done without any IP rights, it was done without any venture capital pretty much, and it was done without any big pharma pretty much. It was done at a fraction of the price that would have happened if it had been done through big pharma, and it was done much faster than it would be by big pharma. So it meant that Australia was first at it. It also meant that we didn't have to employ a whole lot of lawyers, right, because there was no IP involved. What do you say to that? Shouldn't we just abolish IP?
Can you tell me with that example, is that now in market and...
Absolutely, all around the world.
All around the world. Okay. So you're saying that the other innovations may not be getting out because IP is a blocker?
Correct, totally correct. Because
people trying to get the
lawyers
rights.
arguing over who has rights to it, who can produce it, when they can produce it, and they spend years doing this before it ever gets to market.
Okay. I struggle to understand why there aren't many more examples of this wonderful, freely available IP just out there, innovating and transforming our world. It sounds like a great story. How many more of them are there?
Well, I think what happens is that a lot of universities, for example, governments don't want to get involved unless they can get some IP, part of the IP picture, right? So they don't want to open source things. So what I'm saying is, why don't we just open source stuff, or better still, just abolish IP rights altogether?
The only comment I would make is I think that being able to commercialise and get a commercial return by investing in something has worked for some innovations, and I think that's the basis of our system of capitalism. I don't think that it should be the only way to get IP out, and I think I made the concession earlier, not just a concession, something I deeply believe in, that we take, publicly funded research and we do a lot of other things before you use capital as the ignition point to take something to market.
Isn't COVID and the different vaccines developed the perfect example of what you're talking about? Every country was racing to develop a vaccine, The Chinese one has 55% efficacy. The best of the Western ones, the Russian one's even worse apparently, and the best of the Western ones have an 85% efficacy. So the market came up with a better outcome for the benefit of humankind.
With a strong academic infrastructure behind it, like Oxford.
Sure, but they commercialised and it was distributed commercially. Huge profits were made, but it was a much better product than the one that was developed in Russia or China.
And if I could pivot for a moment.
I'm helping you.
Part of that. Yeah, no, and to build on it. Thank you, John. Thank you. One of the other things, though, that came out from that was that we all locked in on a central objective that said, let's put our resources into this thing.
Yeah.
And we, someone asked before, or you asked the question, we've got limited resources and we're going to compete. And which things are going to win? Which was it, panel 1 or panel 2, that we're going to get their innovations up? And what we need to do is we need to take the lazy spend in our health system, because it's something like 14% of GDP, get rid of that stuff that's really dumb spending and put that into both panels 1 and 2 and all their innovations. And that's, again, creating stakeholder alignment around what are we chasing, what's the outcome we want, what are the goals that we want, and how can we dedicate our resources to it.
Yeah, so capitalism, in fact, can come up with a public benefit, but it had to get through the regulatory hoops, although they were compressed in a way that was unprecedented in order to try and stop the pandemic, yeah? So we can do it when we want to. We can get the balance sort of much better. Even Jeannie's falling out of her chair laughing, though.
I am.
Okay, all right. Thank you. I've got Ed here. There was another one over here first as well, and then we'll come back.
Amanda Gilligan again. Can I bring up the issue of people who are really at the very cutting edge are often negated for what they do? And I give the example of Professor Tom Oxley, which people in the room will know him. He's created a device that is implantable through an angiographic catheter to sit on the surface of the brain so that people with motor neuron disease can operate a computer without being able to move their hands or their eyes potentially. So the brain is communicating directly to the computer. This man has spent the last 15 years. He's one of a Melbourne-based trained neurologist who now works in New York and at Melbourne University with an extraordinary idea. He pitched that idea to 200 different groups to get funding, and eventually got funding through the military in the US, just purely through sheer determination, because people didn't believe it would work. And this is one of the difficulties with cutting edge. You're going to fund people who've done very impressive research in the past, but new innovative researchers don't always get there through sheer exhaustion of the process of trying to get through all the paperwork.
Sure, but didn't the US military also fund research into whether or not you could change the thought processes of goats by staring at them?
Correct. But think about the gastric ulcer. We treated it for years with surgery and medication, and some very smart person in Perth came up that there's a bacteria in the bottom of this and we can just give you antibiotics and cure it.
What was it? Barry Marshall? Thank you. Yep. Yeah. The odd Nobel Prize here and there. Yeah. All right. Was that a question or a statement? How do we get over that?
How do we get over that and create the groundbreaking research that we can do without getting stuck?
Okay. Anyone?
Yeah, so I will be pro-happy regulation. I think actually having a successful IP-based rights regime is actually important for one source of funding. That's obviously not going to help everyone, but having venture capital firms who are happy to take a bet on something very uncertain in anticipation of a large reward, I think is actually an important part of creating a diversified funding ecosystem. But that's not enough. Along with that, we also need a much higher level of government funding than I think Australia currently has for research, particularly across a variety of interests. We tend to be stuck in a system that favours certain areas of interest of research far more than others. And if we had a larger pond of research funding, all boats would be lifted, and I think having that available would also allow us to perhaps find out the areas of research that could potentially bring us larger breakthroughs that thus far the commercial sector has not been able to bring to fruition.
Okay. I think Ed's got a question, which is kind of cheating, but...
Okay, so the thing that worries me about this evening's discussion is a question I think to Shannon mostly, but to everybody. It's sometimes very difficult to see the ethical implications and then the legal necessities when you're working on something new. For instance, when Twitter was invented, I thought, stupid waste of time. Who cares what some other person is thinking in 40 characters? It turns out that now Twitter is a major factor in disinformation. It is used consciously by Chinese and Russian governments, right? And Trump and other people, right? And the ethical conundrum didn't become clear until quite a long time in. So now we sit here, we hear from panel number 1 that there's all kinds of wonderful things happening when you start going inside the brain, and you're going to be able to see things and read things and fix things. And from panel number 2, when you go around the brain outside also. So now, if you take the signals that you get from inside and from outside the brain, and let's say you plug them into ChatGPT, right? You knew this was coming, no? And it starts speaking English. It tells you what this brain is thinking, and it tells you what this brain is feeling and stuff. And that may not be such a crazy idea. Nobody foresaw ChatGPT 7 months ago, right? Imagine that happens. And there's somebody who can sort of sense at a distance what your brain is kind of thinking and what you're thinking and things like this. I know a lot of people will be happy to have this in the dating scene, but it's not going to be something that's going to be comfortable for any of us, right? So it's very difficult for the researchers to say, I'm not going to do this. Of course you do this because of the benefits are so good. But it's very difficult for the people around the researchers and the AI people like me who plug into this, who say, well, where do I draw my lines? What do I do? So, Shannon, how do we reason our way through this?
So I think here we have to draw a distinction between bringing a product to market and doing early stage research. Early stage research, as long as it's conducted in accordance with the large number of ethical guidelines available and with institutional policies to protect research participants, is ultimately a good thing. We don't always know if the product that we're developing or the research that we're doing is going to succeed, and nor do we know necessarily what problems it's going to bring. We do our best as researchers to lay out a plan, to think ahead of time, what are the potential implications, what potential harms could our study participants come to, and what is the overall likelihood of benefit from the research. And we go ahead. Every day in this university, there are thousands of studies being conducted whose benefits are potentially uncertain and that has potential risks to participants. After very careful weighing by the Institutional Ethics Board, these experiments have been decided worthwhile and of benefit to humanity, and they go ahead. But when you take the next step and turn that into a product, that's when you have to have additional confidence and be ready to pay the price if there are risks that you were unprepared for. And this is where a lot of what Jeannie talks about comes in. So there's a standard for avoiding negligence, and if you violate that standard, well, then you have to compensate the individuals harmed. On top of that as well, there's the aspect that I mentioned, which is ex ante or beforehand regulation that ensures that certain very high-risk activities are ruled out. Now, of course, we don't want to get too trigger-happy on these ex ante regulations, because, of course, if we have too much regulation preventing you from bringing a product to market in the first place, we'll never get any of the benefits. So there's this careful balance between early-stage research, where you allow a far wider range of potential impacts, but still a careful and considered about it. Then you have some ex-ante regulations to prevent the highest risk activities, and then the rest you leave to a standard like that of negligence, which allows you to bring products to market, but makes you pay a price if you haven't conducted yourself in a reasonable manner.
Okay, we've got one more question over here, and then I think we're out of time.
Hi, Jeremy Whelans. I am one of those VCs. I suppose I just wanted to make some comments as opposed to probably asking a question. And if we take the mesh example, it was actually fraud. So it was intentional fraud that the TGA didn't pick up on. But had the true CE mark gone through the regulation process and then the TGA took the evidence and essentially fast-tracked it, that would have been an example of efficiency, which is exactly what we want. So instead of the CE mark taking a year to assess and then the TGA taking another year to assess, it'd be pretty quick. The second point was about the vaccine. So all the pharma companies that developed the vaccine, they did and supplied that around the globe at super speed, they did that at below cost. So while they sort of made profits, it didn't have any of the future funding, the future sort of pocket of money that goes on to protect or find the next $200 million for the next innovation. So I think that we need to be respectful and appreciate that as well. That's all.
3 cheers for Big Pharma. So, Ginny, did you want to respond?
No, I think that's entirely right. I mean, I think that was the glass half full point, that generally our product liability system, which is ex ante regulation, works very well. Generally, we can believe that our products are safe for us to use, and we can trust the recommend. I mean, doctors were taking in that case too. So I think that you're absolutely right. Usually the system works well, but the question is still, why do we have a legal system regulating both the testing of products and the bringing of the market and the privacy protections of individuals? And it's because, unfortunately, there are some bad actors out there, and we in our society believe that generally those harms should be recognised and compensated rather than sort of pushed to the side. My sister actually is one person who, when she received her 5-year-old booster shots, you know, the ones that your children get for measles, mumps and rubella, she nearly died because she's allergic to the horse serum that used to be used to make those. And she actually now has a disability pension because she has permanent nerve damage from that. All of her children are vaccinated. All of my children are vaccinated, because guess what? That group of kids that nearly died from using horse serum pushed science forward. So sometimes that happens, but the point is that we also live in a system where we go, we should also look after those people, yeah? That's not an example of things going wrong, that's just sometimes it doesn't work, but we still look after people, that's all.
Could you thank our last 3 panellists? And as I introduce Ed, who is going to make some closing remarks, our host, I just want to ask you to dwell on the fact that on a windswept, rainy night in Melbourne, 100 people have come together to ponder these issues at the cutting edge of enterprise, innovation, and ethics. It is, as we've already said, an absolutely astonishing thing happening in this city and this state, in this neighbourhood, in this university. And it is an extraordinary opportunity for the university to produce the next generation that will drive all of this further. It is something that we should all be very proud of, but we also, in our hands, we have that succession, that next plan, that next generation. So let's make sure we get it right. That's my final remark, but Ed is our host and I invite him to close proceedings.
I'd like to say thank you to all the panelists. This was really an interesting evening, I think. I hope you agree. I'd like to say thank you to John and to the whole team who organized this. I think we are at the cusp of all kinds of very interesting things that are going to happen when you bring really interesting research, powerful research, technology and in other application areas, and you put them together. ChatGPT is an example. There's going to be more as AI with its almost infinite plasticity gets applied all over the place. We here at Melbourne Connect are trying to keep our eyes on that, and I invite you to come to future instances of this, the future of. We'll have them every 6 months or so. If you have any ideas, any thoughts of what you'd like to hear about, let me know, please, because there's a lot we can pull together. And it would be nice to make this event, this place, a focal area for interesting, forward-thinking research where all kinds of people come together and new things happen across all the boundaries that we have. Thank you very much for coming. I look forward to seeing you next time.